I still remember the day the sky turned silver. Not the kind of silver you see on a cloudy afternoon, not the shimmer of a lake at sunset. This was different. This was the color of a coin being flipped, of a blade catching light, of something that had no business being in our atmosphere. It hung there for 3 full days motionless, while every channel on every screen showed the same images from every corner of the earth. A ship, a ship so massive it blotted out the sun in some places. So massive that when it finally descended through the clouds, it didn't seem to move so much as the sky simply parted around it. I was in New York when it happened. Just another Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday where you're running late for work, spilling coffee on your shirt, cursing the subway for being 3 minutes behind schedule. I just stepped out of the station at 42nd Street when the air changed. That's the only way I can describe it. The air changed. People stopped walking. That never happens in New York. New Yorkers don't stop walking for anything. Not for celebrities, not for accidents, not for the apocalypse. But we all stopped that morning. The sky was falling. Except it wasn't falling. It was descending. This impossibly huge structure, shaped like a pyramid but wrong somehow, angles that hurt to look at, metal that reflected light in ways that didn't make sense. It came down slowly, deliberately, like a hand reaching for a toy. And when it finally settled over Central Park, crushing trees and flattening the ground like paper, a sound erupted from it. Not a roar, not an explosion, something worse. A hum. That hum stayed with me for the next 3 months. I'd hear it in my dreams. I'd hear it in the silence between songs. I'd hear it when my wife would look at me with those eyes that said, "What happens now?" And I didn't have an answer. The Xylar Empire, they called themselves, came from somewhere past the Orion Nebula, which was about as specific as they ever got. Their ambassador, a creature that looked like a walking praying mantis with too many eyes, stood on a platform that rose from the top of their ship. Every screen in the world broadcast that image. "People of Earth," it said, and its voice was exactly like the hum, resonant, wrong. "You have been selected for inclusion in the Xylar Empire's territories. Your planet is acceptable. Your resources are adequate. Your species shows promise. You will provide tribute." That word, tribute. Tribute in the old days meant gold. It meant grain, cattle, land. It meant the spoils of conquest. In the Xylar Empire, tribute meant something else entirely. A percentage of your planet's annual energy output, the ambassador explained. 20% to be exact. This is non-negotiable. Your energy production will be routed to our collectors immediately. In exchange, you will be given protection. You will be given technology. You will be given the chance to join the galactic community, which is more than most newly discovered species receive. 20% of our energy, let that sink in. 20% of every light bulb. 20% of every factory. 20% of every hospital, every school, every home. 20% of the power that kept people alive, that kept food cold, that kept medicine working. 20% of everything. And they said it like it was nothing, like they were asking for pocket change. The world's leaders gathered. Emergency sessions, emergency broadcasts, emergency everything. The United Nations building looked like an anthill that had been kicked, everyone running everywhere, accomplishing nothing. But here's the thing about humanity that the Xylar Empire didn't understand. Here's the thing about us that they never even considered. We don't give up our power easily. Not the kind of power that comes from a socket, not the kind that comes from a battery, not the kind that comes from burning things and spinning things and splitting atoms. The power that matters to us is the power we make for ourselves. The power we build when we work together, when we think together, when we refuse to accept that someone else gets to decide how bright our lights burn. I saw it happen, I was there. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen with a speech or a battle. It happened in a million tiny moments that added up to something impossible. The day after the Xylar ship landed, I went back to work, We all did, because what else were we supposed to do? The aliens hadn't killed anyone. They hadn't destroyed anything. They just arrived and told us we owed them. My office was on the 34th floor of a building that had once been impressive. Now it was just another building in the shadow of an alien spacecraft. I could see the ship from my window, could see the way it seemed to pulse with that humming energy, could see the smaller ships that came and went from its surface, like bees returning to a hive. My boss, a man named Richard who'd never met a spreadsheet he didn't love, called a meeting. The company has received instructions from the planetary government, he said, his voice tight. Starting next week, 20% of our power will be routed to the Xylar collectors. This means cutbacks. This means layoffs. This means we all need to be prepared for significant changes. Significant changes. That was one way to put it. I remember looking around that conference room, at the faces of people I'd worked with for years, at Sarah, who just had a baby, at Mike, whose wife was sick, at Emily, who was putting herself through night school, at all of us sitting there being told that 20% of our power was about to be taken away. And I remember thinking, what happens when they want more? Because they would. They definitely would. 20% today, 30 tomorrow, 50 the day after that. That's how empires work. That's how they've always worked. They take what they want and then they want more. I didn't say anything in that meeting. None of us did. What was there to say? We were just people, just regular, ordinary people. What could we possibly do against an empire that had crossed the galaxy? But that night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to my wife, listening to her breathe, listening to the hum that had become the background noise of our lives. And I thought about power, about what it meant, about how it worked. And I thought about something my grandfather used to say. Money, he'd told me once, is just energy that's been stored up. You work, you create energy, you turn it into money, you save it, and when you need it, you spend it. That's all it is. Stored human energy. He'd been a banker, a boring, middle-of-the-road banker who'd never done anything more exciting than balance a ledger. But he'd understood something fundamental about how the world worked. What if, I thought, we treated the Xylar Empire like they were just another customer? What if we treated their demand for tribute like a bill? And what if we decided to pay that bill the way we'd paid every other bill in our history? With interest, with terms, with conditions. With all the clever, complicated, frustrating financial maneuvers that humanity had perfected over thousands of years of trading with each other. I sat up in bed, my wife stirred. "What's wrong?" she murmured. "Nothing," I said. "Go back to sleep." But something was happening, something was starting. An idea. A ridiculous, impossible, probably stupid idea. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning I did something I'd never done before. I went to the UN. Not to the building itself, obviously. That was surrounded by so much security that you couldn't get within 3 blocks without a badge and a background check. But I went to the temporary encampment where the lower-level workers were staying, where the people who processed paperwork and answered phones and made coffee were gathered. I knew a guy. His name was David, and we'd gone to college together. He'd ended up working as a translator for the diplomatic corps, which was a fancy way of saying he got paid to listen to aliens speak and try to figure out what they meant. "David," I said, finding him in the cafeteria line, "I need to talk to you." He looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "What are you doing here? How did you even get in?" "Don't worry about that. I need to ask you something about the Xylar." He glanced around nervously. "We're not supposed to talk about them." "David, please, this is important." He sighed, grabbed his tray, and motioned for me to follow him to a corner table. The cafeteria was packed with people who all looked exhausted, all looked like they hadn't slept in days. "All right," he said, sitting down. "What do you want to know?" "How do they handle money?" He blinked. "What?" "Money, currency, trade? How do the Xyler handle their financial affairs? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. They're an empire, they just take what they want. Right, that's what they do. But that's not how they work internally, is it? They have to have some system for exchanging goods and services, some way of allocating resources. You can't run an empire on tribute alone. There has to be an internal economy. David stared at me. Why do you care? We're talking about interstellar conquerors, not a hostile takeover. That's exactly what this is, I said. A hostile takeover. And the first thing you do in a hostile takeover is examine the books. I was starting to sound crazy. I knew I was starting to sound crazy. But I couldn't stop. The idea was too big, too strange, too possible. Look, I said, lowering my voice. They want 20% of our energy. Fine, we'll give it to them, but we're not going to just hand it over. We're going to make them work for it. How do you make someone work for something they're just taking? Contracts, I said. Terms, conditions. You know what they didn't do when they landed. They didn't declare war. They didn't bomb us. They didn't do anything except make a demand, which means they're operating under some kind of rules, some kind of legal framework. Maybe it's their law. Maybe it's galactic law, but there has to be a process. David was quiet for a long moment. Then he started to laugh. You're insane, he said. You're completely insane. You want to outlawyer an alien empire. Not outlawyer them, I said. Outcalculate them. They think they're dealing with a primitive species that just got discovered. They think we'll panic and surrender. They don't realize they're dealing with people who have been negotiating trades since before their empire even existed. But they're an empire that spans multiple star systems. Exactly. Multiple star systems means multiple jurisdictions, multiple economies, multiple systems of exchange. That's a nightmare to manage, David. Do you know what it's like to run a business in multiple countries? The regulations alone will kill you. Now imagine that across light years. He stopped laughing. I kept going. They're going to have representatives here, ambassadors, traders, some kind of personnel that handle the day-to-day operations. We need to find them, figure out who they are, and start talking to them. Talking to them about what? About terms, about how the tribute will be managed, about what happens if our energy production fluctuates, about what happens if there's a dispute, about everything. David shook his head. I don't think you understand how big of a gap we're dealing with here. They're an empire. We're one planet, one species that only recently discovered how to fly to its own moon. And that's our advantage, I said. We're small. We're nimble. We can adapt. We don't have to maintain an economy across dozens of star systems. We just have to keep our own economy running while making theirs work for us. We can't make their economy work for us. We don't even know how their economy works. Then we learn that's what we do. That's what humans have always done. We learn, we adapt. We find the weakness and we exploit it. David was looking at me differently now. Not like I was crazy. Like I was someone who just had an idea so big that it couldn't be properly understood all at once. What are you suggesting? He asked. I'm suggesting that we treat this like a business deal. And I'm suggesting that we need a team of the best financial minds on the planet to handle it. The best financial minds. We have them. We've always had them. The banks, the hedge funds, the trading floors, the people who move money around the world every day. They understand leverage. They understand negotiation. They understand how to use someone else's resources against them. But the Xyler won't know what hit them, I said, because they're not expecting it. They're expecting fear. They're expecting violence. They're expecting surrender. They're not expecting a hostile takeover of their own financial system. I stood up. I need to make some calls. To who? To everyone I know who's ever closed a deal. That was the beginning of something that would change everything. I didn't know it at the time, of course. I just knew that I had an idea, and that idea kept growing, kept expanding, kept taking up more and more space in my head until I couldn't think about anything else. I called everyone I knew. Lawyers, bankers, accountants, traders, people who'd been in the game for decades, people who'd seen it all, people who'd made and lost fortunes. And to my complete surprise, they listened. They didn't always understand. Sometimes they thought I was crazy, sometimes they laughed, sometimes they hung up on me. But enough of them didn't. Enough of them heard something in my voice that made them stop and think. "We're going to need a plan," I said to the first group that gathered in my apartment. "A real plan, something that accounts for every possibility." "Against an alien empire," said Marcus Chen, a hedge fund manager who'd been named one of the most influential people in finance. "We don't even know what their currency is." "So we'll create one for them," said Patricia Okonkwo, a former central banker from Nigeria. "We'll create a system that's so complicated, so interwoven, so impossible to unwind, that they can't just take what they want without breaking something." "That's brilliant," said someone else. "That's absolutely brilliant." "It's dangerous," said Patricia. "If they catch on, they could just destroy us. They have the weapons, they have the ships, they don't need to follow any rules." "But they will," I said. "That's the thing. They will follow the rules because they have to. An empire that doesn't follow its own rules doesn't stay an empire for long. They need stability. They need predictability. They need to be able to plan." "And we can give them that," said Marcus. "We can give them exactly what they need, and we can make them pay for it." The plan started to take shape. It was beautiful, really. A work of art. A masterpiece of financial engineering that would have made the most complex derivatives look like children's toys. We called it Project Abacus. The idea was simple. The Xyler wanted energy. We would give it to them. But we would give it to them in a way that tied their economy to ours so completely that they couldn't untangle it without destroying themselves. We created energy credits. That part was obvious, but the credits weren't just a simple measurement of energy. They were complex financial instruments. They had expiration dates. They had interest rates. They could be traded, swapped, hedged, and leveraged. We made the first few transactions deliberately confusing. We'd send a shipment of energy to the Xyler collectors, but we'd attach so many conditions, so many riders, so many legal technicalities, that by the time they figured out what they'd actually received, it was already too late. They'd signed contracts. They'd agreed to terms. They'd bound themselves to a system they didn't fully understand. "Is this going to work?" I asked Marcus one night, months into the project. We were in a basement office we'd rented in Brooklyn. The kind of place that had no windows and smelled like mildew. But it was secure, and we could work there without being observed. "It has to work," he said. "If it doesn't work, we're all dead anyway." "That's not what I asked." "I know," he sighed. "Look, I've been in finance for 30 years. I've seen deals that looked impossible go through. I've seen deals that looked ironclad fall apart. The one thing I've learned is that nothing is certain. But this is the best chance we've got." "The Xyler are old," I said. "Really old. They've been an empire for thousands of years. They've seen everything." "They haven't seen this," he said. "They haven't seen someone turn their own system against them. They haven't seen someone use finance as a weapon. They haven't seen someone make their tribute so complicated that they can't collect it without breaking something else. That's the plan. That's the plan. We make the tribute so complex, so intertwined with our own economy, that the moment they try to take more, the whole thing collapses. They can have 20%. They can have it forever. But if they ever try to take 30% or 50% or 100%, they lose everything. And they'll just accept that. They'll have to, because by the time they realize what's happened, they'll be too deeply invested to pull out. They'll have spent years building infrastructure to handle the credits. They'll have trained personnel. They'll have integrated the system into their own economy. It'll be too expensive to change. I nodded slowly. So we make ourselves essential. Exactly. Not essential in terms of resources. Essential in terms of financial structure. We make ourselves so integral to their accounting that they can't afford to lose us. That's insane. I was going to say brilliant. Same thing, really. We presented the plan to the UN 3 months later. Or rather, a small group of us presented it to a very skeptical group of diplomats and military leaders. "You want to what?" said General Morrison, the head of the Joint Chiefs. "You want to give them a financial system." "We want to give them a financial system that makes them dependent on us," I said. "A system that's so complex, so interwoven with our own, that they can't collect their tribute without playing by our rules." "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "Is it?" said Marcus. "Because from where I'm sitting it's the only option we have. You want to fight them. They have ships that can travel faster than light. They have weapons we can't even imagine. Fighting them isn't an option. Neither is surrender, not really. The only option is to make ourselves too valuable to destroy." "We are too valuable to destroy," said a diplomat whose name I can't remember. "They need our energy." "They need energy," I said. "They don't need us. They could strip our planet bare and move on. But if we make ourselves essential to their operations, they can't do that without destroying their own system." General Morrison looked skeptical. "And you think you can do this? A bunch of bankers and lawyers?" "Not a bunch," said Patricia. The best financial minds on the planet, people who have been playing this game their whole lives." The room was quiet. I could see the gears turning in people's heads. The generals were thinking about tactics. The diplomats were thinking about diplomacy. The politicians were thinking about their careers. I was thinking about something else. I was thinking about my grandfather, about his words, about money being stored human energy. That's what we were doing, really. We were storing up our energy in a form that the Xyler couldn't simply take. We were making it so they had to trade for it, had to negotiate for it, had to participate in our system. We were making ourselves partners, not subjects. It was a gamble, a huge, ridiculous, probably suicidal gamble. But what else were we going to do? The first thing we did was print money. Not real money, not the kind you could hold in your hand. Digital currency, energy credits. Each credit represented 1 kilowatt-hour of energy that we were contractually obligated to deliver to the Xyler Empire. We gave the credits value by making them tradable. Suddenly, companies could buy and sell energy credits. Banks could hold them as assets. Investors could speculate on them. We made it so that the Xyler Empire itself was one of the biggest holders of these credits. They needed the energy, after all. They had to buy it from us. But we also made it so that the credits had to be converted through a complex system of exchanges. You couldn't just hand over a credit and get energy. You had to go through the market. You had to pay fees. You had to wait for settlement. We made it slow, we made it complicated, we made it profitable. The Xyler Empire didn't notice at first. They just saw that their energy was being delivered. Why would they care about the details? But the details mattered. The details were everything. We put in clauses, we put in conditions, we put in loopholes. If the Xyler Empire tried to increase the tribute, the credits would become more expensive. Not because we made them more expensive, but because the market would react. The supply would dwindle. The price would rise. If the Xyler Empire tried to take more than their share, the system would collapse. Banks would fail. The markets would crash. The whole thing would turn to dust. We built it so that any disruption would be catastrophic, not for us but for them. We were basically saying, take what you want, but know that if you take too much, everything you've built here will fall apart. And the Xyler Empire, for all their power, had built a lot. They'd built infrastructure. They'd built relationships. They'd built an entire system of governance around the tribute they were collecting. And all of it relied on our financial system working smoothly. It took 2 years. 2 years of negotiations, 2 years of fine-tuning, 2 years of watching the Xylar Empire slowly integrate our system into their own. It was fascinating, really, like watching a whale learn to use a credit card. The Xylar ambassador, that giant mantis creature, would come to our meetings and try to understand what we were doing. "Your system is very complex," it said once. "We are having difficulty tracking the flow." "That's by design," I said. "The complexity ensures stability. Each transaction is backed by collateral. Each credit is verified. The system is self-regulating." "Self-regulating," it repeated. "This is a concept we understand, but we do not understand why you have so many intermediaries, so many steps." "Because we value security," I said. "We want to be sure that every transaction is legitimate, that every credit is real, that every exchange is fair." The ambassador's eyes, all 6 of them, swiveled to look at me. "You have created a system that is difficult to manipulate," it said. "This is admirable." "Thank you," I said. "We value transparency and fairness above all." It was a lie, of course. We valued making things so complicated that no one could figure out what was really going on. We valued hiding our true strength behind a maze of numbers. But the ambassador didn't know that. No one knew that, not really. The people in the room with me, the ones who'd helped create this system, they knew, but they didn't say anything. They just sat there looking professional and trustworthy. We were good at that, looking trustworthy. It's amazing how powerful you can be when no one realizes you're playing a game. The first major crisis came 3 years in. The Xylar Empire discovered that some of the energy they were receiving wasn't what they'd expected. It wasn't that we were cheating them exactly. It was that the energy had been routed through so many exchanges, so many intermediaries, so many contracts, that it was hard to tell exactly what they were getting. "We have detected discrepancies," the ambassador said one day. "The energy we receive seems to be transformed. There is something different about it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Different how?" I asked. "It is less pure, more difficult to process. Our collectors are having trouble using it." I looked at Marcus, he looked at me. "Ah," I said, "that might be because of the conversion process." "Conversion process?" "Yes, you see, when energy is traded through the market, it goes through a series of transformations. Electrical to mechanical, mechanical to chemical, chemical back to electrical. Each transformation leaves a trace, a signature." The ambassador's eyes blinked independently. "This is acceptable." "Acceptable? No, but it's necessary. It's how the system works. The energy is still there. It still contains the same amount of power. It just has to be processed differently." "We were not told about this." "I'm telling you now," I said. "You see, your own systems are designed for raw energy, direct energy, energy that hasn't been converted, but our system is designed for energy that's been through the market. There's a difference. A difference that you didn't disclose." "We disclosed everything in the contracts," I said. "Every single transaction has a full prospectus. Every exchange has a rule book. It's all there if you look." The ambassador was quiet for a long moment. "We will look," it said. "We will look very carefully." And they did. Over the next few months, the Xylar Empire poured through our contracts. They hired experts. They brought in their own financial advisors. They tried to understand the system we'd built. They couldn't. Not because they weren't smart enough. They were brilliant in their way. They'd traveled across the galaxy. They'd conquered dozens of worlds. They knew things that we couldn't imagine. But they didn't know human finance. They didn't know the history. They didn't know the traditions. They didn't know the subtle, complex, often absurd ways that humans had developed to exchange value. They couldn't understand why we needed so many different kinds of contracts, why we needed so many different kinds of exchanges, why we needed so many different kinds of financial instruments. I explained it to them as best I could. You see, I said, we have a saying on Earth. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. It means you should diversify, spread your risk. That way, if one thing goes wrong, you don't lose everything. Your system is designed to handle uncertainty, said the ambassador, to manage risk. Exactly, that's its strength. It can adapt to any situation, it can absorb any shock. The ambassador was quiet again. Then it said something that surprised me. You are a clever species, it said. You have created a system that is resilient. I nodded, that's the idea. But the Xyler Empire didn't give up. They'd found a vulnerability, and they were determined to exploit it. They started creating their own financial instruments. They started trading among themselves. They started building their own version of our system, one that was simpler, more direct, more transparent. We should have seen it coming. Of course they would try to bypass us. Of course they would try to create their own system. But we'd been so focused on making our system complicated that we'd forgotten to make it indispensable. We have to evolve, I said to the team. We have to make it so they can't do without us. How? Asked Marcus. We give them something they can't create on their own, something that requires human expertise, something that's tied to our culture. And that is? I don't know yet, I said, but we're going to figure it out. So we went back to work. We created new instruments. We created new markets. We created new ways to trade value that only humans could understand. We created derivatives that were tied to human population growth. We created contracts that were tied to the weather. We created financial products that were so specifically human, so tied to our planet and our history, that the Xyler Empire couldn't replicate them. It wasn't easy. It took time. It took ingenuity. It took all the creativity we could muster. But we did it. And the Xyler Empire, for all their power, couldn't keep up. They tried. They really tried. They brought in more experts, built more infrastructure, invested more resources. But they couldn't match us, because they didn't have the history, they didn't have the culture, they didn't have the human spirit. The rebellion, when it came, wasn't what anyone expected. It didn't come with weapons. It didn't come with armies. It didn't come with declarations or defiance. It came with defaults. One day, the Xyler Empire couldn't pay its bills. They'd overextended themselves. They'd invested too heavily in their own system, built too many dependencies, taken on too much risk. And when one of their major trading partners defaulted, the whole thing started to unravel. It was like watching a house of cards collapse. One by one, the financial institutions failed. One by one, the markets crashed. One by one, the Xyler Empire's economy ground to a halt. And the amazing thing was, we didn't cause it. We didn't do anything. We just stood back and watched. We have to help them, I said to the team. If their economy collapses, ours goes with it. Are you sure? Asked Marcus. This could be our chance to break free. Break free to what? A world that's more isolated than ever. A world that's even more alone. We need them as much as they need us, maybe more. So we helped them. We restructured their debt. We recapitalized their banks. We gave them loans and grants and all the other tools of financial rescue. We saved them. And in saving them, we cemented our position. The Xyler Empire was now our partner, not our conqueror, not our master, our partner. We had the leverage, we had the expertise, we had the system that they couldn't live without. And they knew it. The day the ambassador came to thank us, I was in the same conference room where we'd first met. You have saved our empire, it said. We are grateful. You don't need to be grateful, I said. We're partners now. Partners help each other. Partners, it repeated. Yes, we understand this concept now. We have learned much from you. Good, because we have more to teach. More. Much more. You see, our system is evolving. It's always evolving. That's its strength. It never stays the same. It adapts, it grows, it becomes something new. The ambassador was quiet for a long moment. Your species is remarkable, it finally said. You have turned our conquest into something else, something we didn't anticipate. We turned it into a business relationship, I said. That's what we do. We turn everything into a business relationship. Even conquest. Especially conquest. Conquest is just a hostile takeover, and hostile takeovers can be managed. They can be negotiated. They can be turned into something profitable. The ambassador's eyes blinked slowly. Profitable, it said. Yes, we have learned that word. After the ambassador left, I stood alone in the conference room, looking out at the city. New York was still New York. It would always be New York. That was the amazing thing about humans. No matter what happened, no matter what changed, we kept going. We kept working, we kept building, we kept making things better. And in the process, we'd done something incredible. We'd taken an alien empire and turned it into a business. Not a subject, not a conqueror, not a master. A business. Stored human energy, I said to myself, quoting my grandfather. That's what money was. That's what our system was. That's what we'd done. We'd taken the energy of our planet, the energy of our people, and we'd stored it in a form that couldn't be taken. We'd made ourselves indispensable. Not through weapons, not through strength, not through fear. Through finance. The hum never really left. It was there in the background, a constant reminder of what had happened. But it changed eventually. It became softer, more comforting, like a heartbeat. We'd made our peace with the Xylar Empire. We'd made our place in the galaxy. And we'd done it our way. The human way. The way of the deal, the way of the contract, the way of the balance sheet. It wasn't the way anyone expected. It wasn't the way the aliens had anticipated. It wasn't even the way we'd planned. But it worked. And that was all that mattered. Years later, when my children asked me about the invasion, I told them the truth. Remember, I said, money isn't just money, it's energy, it's power. It's the work we do, the things we build, the lives we live, all stored up. So money is like a battery, my daughter asked. Exactly, I said. A battery for human effort, and we used that battery to save the world. Did we win? I thought about it. About all the battles that had been fought, all the losses that had been suffered, all the victories that had been won. Winning doesn't matter, I said. What matters is that we're still here, still building, still trading, still being human. She nodded, not entirely understanding. One day you will, I told her. One day you'll see, we didn't win through strength. We didn't win through courage. We won through cleverness. We won through resilience. We won through being so stubbornly, infuriatingly human that nothing could stop us. And that was the thing. That was the real victory. Not the defeat of the empire, though that was important. Not the survival of our species, though that mattered most. The real victory was that we kept being ourselves. We kept building, we kept trading, we kept making things better. We didn't become the empire. We didn't become the conquerors. We didn't become anyone else. We stayed human. The Xylar Empire, for all their power, never really understood us. They understood our finances. They understood our contracts. They understood our markets. But they never understood what drove us, what made us get up every morning and do the work, what made us create and build and grow. What is your secret? The ambassador asked me once. How do you keep going? How do you keep creating? How do you keep wanting? I thought about it. about all the reasons, all the motivations, all the drives. Because we're human, I said, because we can't stop, because we'll always find a way. That is not a satisfying answer. It's the only answer I have. And it was. It's still the only answer I have. We are who we are. We do what we do. We keep going because that's what we do. And no empire, no matter how vast, no matter how powerful, no matter how old, can change that. They came demanding tribute. We gave them a financial plan. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. The only thing that ever matters. The ability to keep going. The ability to adapt. The ability to turn even the worst situation into something that works. That's humanity. That's us. And that's the story I tell my children and my children's children. The story of how we turned an alien empire into a business partner. How we used finance to save our world. How we kept being human, no matter what. I'm not a hero. I never was. I'm just a guy who had an idea and wouldn't let it go. There were thousands of us in the end. Maybe millions. People from every walk of life, every country, every culture. We didn't have weapons. We didn't have armies. We didn't have superpowers. We had spreadsheets. We had contracts. We had a deep, abiding, almost pathological belief that no matter how bad things got, we could figure out a way. And we did. We turned the greatest threat humanity had ever faced into just another business deal. The aliens came demanding tribute. We gave them a payment plan. And we made it stick. The hum is still there. It will probably always be there. But it's different now. It's not a threat. It's not a demand. It's just background noise. The sound of two economies working together. The sound of two species learning to coexist. The sound of humanity surviving as we always have, as we always will. There are no heroes in this story. Just people. Just people doing what people do. Making deals. Making it work. Making it last. And that, I think, is the best story of all. The story of how we kept being ourselves. The story of how we kept being human. The story of how we turned an alien invasion into a business transaction. And won. The end. The energy credits are still there. The markets are still running. The Xyler Empire is still our partner. And humanity. Humanity is still humanity. We haven't conquered the galaxy. We haven't become an empire. We've become something else. Something better. We've become the people who turn threats into opportunities. We've become the people who find a way. We've become the people who won't ever give up. No matter what. No matter how dark the sky gets. No matter how loud the hum. No matter how impossible the odds. We keep going. We always keep going. Because that's what we do. That's who we are. The human way.